before the sermon, I just wanted to read a few verses from that very well-known love verse, 1 Corinthians, love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful. It is not arrogant or rude. Love does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrong, but rejoices in the right. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Some of you know that for a week every July, the McConnell family gathers at the Southern Outer Banks in North Carolina for a week of doing absolutely nothing except enjoying the ocean and one another. The most arduous task I have all week are putting up the beach umbrellas and taking my turn at the grill. We rent a 6-bedroom house, and whoever shows up, shows up. Some summers in the over 25 years we have been doing this, I've been assigned the couch because the bedrooms are maxed out. This year, earlier in the week, my daughter from Seattle and I were the only ones from our family left on the beach later in the afternoon. And we were having some good father-daughter conversations, and at which time we noticed an elderly gentleman motioning to his family to come out of the water. Then we saw another group get out, then we saw another one get out. Both of us curious about this, of course. My daughter went over to one of the groups and asked them what was up. One person informed her that about a 4-foot shark was sighted close to the shore, thus the exodus of all the swimmers. It was an eerie sight. Everybody on the beach, nobody in the ocean. But the very next day, it was like the shark had never been seen, and everybody was back in the water. Well, you know, the preacher is always looking for a good illustration. Thought of two things: how quickly moods and feelings and fears can change. And then the verse from Ecclesiastes, for everything there is a season. In this case, there's a time to be in the water and there's a time to be out of the water. The book of Ecclesiastes is philosophical and speaks to the importance of timing in our concern for and in our relationship to others, in addition to raising questions about the purpose of life. Ecclesiastes is one of the 5 books of the Old Testament that is commonly referred to as the wisdom books. The other 4 are Job and Psalms and Proverbs and the Song of Solomon. Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, and Job are specifically called wisdom literature, mainly because they focus on universal human concerns, but in some cases have competing viewpoints. Proverbs, for instance, suggests that the virtuous always, most of the time at least, reap rewards, such as a good man will obtain favor from God. Whereas Job challenges this concept, evidenced by the virtuous and righteous Job losing everything he worked for, everything he loved, including his family, leaving him to say in anguish, "Let the day perish on which I was born." Ecclesiastes, a part of the wisdom literature, in the Greek means member of an assembly, and the book's writing has often been credited to King Solomon, son of David, the 3rd king of Israel, known for his wealth and fame. The writer at times, Solomon, is skeptical about a person's purpose in the world. Often referred to as the philosopher by biblical commentaries, Solomon alternates between feeling really good about things and feeling really bad about things. Verse 9 in the 1st chapter, "What profit is there to the worker from which he toils?" Contrasts significantly to verse 13 in the same chapter, "Every man who eats and drinks sees good in his behavior. It is a perfect gift." Now, with the book of Ecclesiastes, it's often difficult to determine on which side of the street Solomon is walking, on the side of clear direction and clear purpose, or on the side of distaste and dissatisfaction. In Solomon's darker and more pessimistic moments, he writes about what he refers to as the futility of life. For who knows, he says, what is good for a man during his lifetime? During the few years of his futile life, he will spend them like a shadow. But the writer also says earlier on about God, he has made everything appropriate in his time. He's also set eternity into the heart of man. Solomon at times takes on the form of a Jekyll and Hyde. And with all the dichotomies and irregularities in Ecclesiastes, Solomon at times appears discouraged about the purpose of his own life, and certainly acknowledges the inconsistencies of life, all the time seemingly unsure about his own personal direction. Reminding me a little bit about the conversation between Alice and the Cheshire Cat in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, after Alice has fallen into a rabbit hole and encounters a fantasy world populated by peculiar and anthropomorphic creatures. Alice asks the Cheshire Cat, "Would you please tell me which way I ought to go from here?" The cat replies, "That depends a great deal on where you want to go." Alice says, "I don't much care where." The cat says, "Then it doesn't matter which way you go." I recently read in The Economist magazine an obituary of an English foreign secretary and an aide to 6 prime ministers named Peter VI, Lord Carrington, who said his favorite book was Alice in Wonderland, which helped him maintain perspective in a world of contradictions and in a world of incomprehension at times, in addition to maintaining his humor throughout all the arduous talks and difficult negotiations. So the mood of the writer of Ecclesiastes sets the stage for the well-known first 10 verses of Ecclesiastes 3, which is read by Margot Lobhan today. The writer talks about the fact that there is an appointed time for everything. There is a time to give birth, there is a time to die, there is a time to weep, there is a time to laugh, there is a time to embrace, there is a time to refrain from embracing, there is a time to be silent, there is a time to speak, and all the other illustrations the writer uses. As a teenager, I used to turn my radio up when the song Turn, Turn, Turn came on. The rock group called the Byrds dramatically increased the exposure of this very well-known passage with their musical version of it in Ecclesiastes 3 in the 60s. But consistent with the theme of inconsistency that sweeps through the intriguing book of Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 10, addresses the fact that there are often no standard formulaic responses to life's most pressing and perplexing problems. What might be an appropriate response today might be inappropriate tomorrow. What might be a good way of handling a situation with a particular person might not be a good way with another. What might be one way of expressing your true feelings might have to wait until the time is right. What you think might be the time to offer someone a piece of your mind may precisely be the time that you need to demonstrate restraint. What you think might be the time to bring things together and to piece things together might be the time to just start over. In other words, as Jesus said, the wind blows where it will, and you do not know whence it comes or whither it goes. So it is with life. God wants us to remain open to the Spirit movement in our lives, so we are strengthened to do the right thing at the right time and not the wrong thing at the wrong time. The Genesis lesson read by Robin this morning, I believe, perfectly illustrates the compassion of reaching out at the right time, illustrating a larger truth in a life is bigger than yourself. And when we think of things in this context, all now is not vanity and chasing after the wind, as Solomon laments in the 14th verse of the first chapter. The story of Joseph and his brother is a beautiful story of redemption, which takes life to another level of meaning and another level of purpose. Some of you remember how the story goes. Joseph, the favorite son, is sold into his slavery by his scoundrels brothers, ends up in Egypt as a slave, quickly and dramatically rises through the ranks and becomes Pharaoh's top lieutenant, and later a great famine ensues across the land, and Joseph's brothers seek relief and assistance from Egypt, as do thousands of others. But before that, Joseph, the great predictor of things, through his interpretation of dreams, warns the Pharaoh that there will be 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine. Prepare for the worst. So in its preparation, Egypt was flush with grain during the famine. The reason for it, Joseph's brothers calling. After a cat and mouse game, the brothers finally figure out that the member of the Pharaoh's court that they are dealing with is his brother, is their brother. And they are fearing the worst. And one of the best verses in the book of Genesis, I believe, comes at the very end, when Joseph is faced with a decision on what to do with his brothers. Lock them up forever or forgive them. In his magnanimity, Joseph takes the high road. He says to his brothers, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." Such perception on the part of Joseph, such insight, such grace. He realized that God turned his tragedy into a triumph in a world crisis. It took a special person to understand this and to overcome his instincts for revenge. There are moments that challenge us in our everyday world to rise to the occasion when your instincts are telling you to do the opposite, can turn the humdrum of life into the truly special. You know, there can be days when you wonder what it's all about, like the writer in Ecclesiastes wondered, kind of like the movie Groundhog Day. You know, when you get up in the morning and you repeat the same routine that you had the day before, or you see the familiar places and people and you do the normal chores, you complete the assigned task, and you fulfill your ordinary responsibilities. You shop at the same grocery store, we fill our gas tanks at the same gas station, we eat dinner at our favorite restaurants, we sit at our favorite chairs in the family room and often falling asleep, as I do, ordering out your favorite pizza, having the same conversation, saying the same things, expecting the same results. But all these things are a great comfort to us because we know routine provides predictability, and predictability provides security. And there's much to be said for this. But the writer of Ecclesiastes, King Solomon, who had more riches and power than one could ever imagine, has done us a great favor with this book. And the early church fathers who canonized the book of Ecclesiastes into the Holy Scriptures have also done us a great favor, even though it's a challenge to understand. Because the book makes you and me think about taking ourselves beyond our routines to another level of living. And that is, we shouldn't always do what we expect ourselves to do and what others expect us to do. But we do what is right in God's eyes, and we do what is right for the greater good. And the answers aren't always laid out so neatly for us, like a well-marked roadmap or a precise GPS system. But when one starts from the premise of God's love, as Paul eloquently writes about in 1 Corinthians, including the few verses I read before the sermon, the fog begins to lift in our understanding of Ecclesiastes. What Solomon didn't emphasize was the power of love and how it can bring many of life's questions together with a simple understanding of how God's love gives meaning to life, just as it did to Joseph in his relationship to his brothers, and how everything comes together when one operates under the foundation of love. This is the missing piece of the puzzle of Ecclesiastes. Without it, all is vanity and chasing after the wind. One of Senator Moran's colleagues, Senator John McCain, tells the story of an encounter with a North Vietnamese prison guard when he was a prisoner of war for 5 years during the Vietnam War, as many of you know, after his plane was shot down as a Navy pilot. In the book, This I Believe, edited by Jay Allison and Dan Getteman, Senator McCain reports that after being tied in torture ropes one night and left in a room alone to suffer, a guard he had never spoken to before came into the room and loosened his ropes to relieve his suffering. Just before morning, he said, the same guard came back to retighten the ropes before others came in. Some months later, on a Christmas morning, as John McCain stood alone in the prison courtyard, he tells this story, the same guard walked up to him and stood next to him for a few moments, and then with his sandal, he drew a cross in the dirt. Senator McCain said that they stood wordlessly there for a minute or two, venerating the cross until the guard rubbed it out and walked away. Then Senator McCain said, to me that was faith, a faith that unites and never divides, a faith that bridges the unbridgeable gaps in humanity. It's a faith that I would die to defend. You know, if there is any question about the purpose of life, one just needs to look to the cross of Jesus Christ. King Solomon didn't have that advantage, but we do.